churches and COVID continue to be the big topic and the important topic and the one in the forefront of most pastoral leaders' minds. We are so fortunate. I think I've said in Lisa Allgood's presence that I'm fairly convinced that she's a 21st century Esther, that her arrival in the Presbytery of Cincinnati as their transitional executive presbyter was especially timely, not because of her formidable theological gifts and her love of the church, but because by trade, once upon a time in a previous life, she's an epidemiologist with particular in infectious disease. Lisa's a ruling elder and a great colleague. And we're so thankful that she had time to be with us. She's got an amazing road show that COVID has created and that Zoom calls have facilitated. And we're so glad to be on your resume now, Lisa.
There you go.
Another presbytery that gets to hear from a scientist who's also a church leader. And so we're glad to have you with us.
Very good. Jennifer, thank you. Thank you for having me, and happy 2021, everyone. It feels very good to say 2020 was last year. My guess is at this point, almost a year into this COVID journey, that you've heard probably more data than you need. And so I may skip over some of the basic pieces, but I want to get to sort of where we are now. You all know this is a coronavirus. You know why. It's got those spikes around the globule. It's a messenger RNA virus. That's its genetic code. We've had many coronaviruses before. 4 species just caused the common cold. 2 others have caused pandemics in the past. SARS back in 2004 and MERS that came out of the Middle East in 2012. They were not nearly as infectious as this coronavirus, but far more fatal. And so this coronavirus is, from a fatality standpoint, is actually fairly wimpy. This coronavirus is insidious for other reasons, and we'll go into that a little bit. This virus is 3 times more infectious than anything else from a respiratory standpoint. You've seen some information about recent mutations that make them even more infectious. There's one strain that came out of Europe that infects, I've seen between 60 to 70% more effectively. The one that's now in South Africa is about 40 to 50% more infectious. Neither one of them cause more disease or more fatality. They just infect faster. The downside of that is the more people that get infected, the more the hospital systems are overrun. So those mutations are bad for that reason. It's not that they cause more disease. This genetic sequence was actually completed back in January of last year, and that's the genesis for all of the vaccine development that you've seen in the meantime. The infectivity of this virus is really, really fast, even without the mutations. If you go back and you look at some of the data that have been created, exposure, the chances that you're going to get infected are dependent on 2 factors: how much of the virus you're exposed to and how long you're exposed to it. Maximum chances of being exposed and being infected occur after only 15 minutes. And originally, CDC said that's 15 consecutive minutes. Now they're saying it's 15 accumulative minutes. So if you're in a sanctuary or closed space for an hour and you encounter a couple of different people who are infected, all of that starts to add up. That has implications for sanctuaries opening, obviously. The other part of this is that about 40% of the people who are actually tested positive never develop symptoms. And so people who appear perfectly healthy, who are sitting across from you, could still be infectious. In fact, some data says they are actually more infectious than people who are having symptoms. Those people who develop symptoms takes about 2 to 8 days for the symptoms to emerge. So again, over the course of 2 Sundays, someone who looks perfectly normal could still be shedding virus and could still be infectious. It's one of the insidious parts of this virus. There are so many ways that it sneaks in through community spread because it doesn't manifest itself overtly and quickly. The other piece, I think, that was probably one of the more chilling pieces of information I heard on a CDC call, my background still allows me entree into some of the CDC work, was that when children were tested, there were 3 separate studies done last September before schools started to open back up of young kids ages 4 to 17. They are largely asymptomatic unless there's a serious underlying medical condition. Young kids who are asymptomatic had 25 times the amount of virus in their nasal airways as a hospitalized adult. So if you don't think asymptomatic young kids are community vectors, think again. And it's probably why so many of our teachers are getting ill. This virus is not highly fatal. It's about a 1% fatality rate, and that's actually going down a little bit, not because of the virus itself, but because we've learned how to deal with it in a hospital setting. That's 10 times more fatal than the flu, but it's about 50 times less fatal than something like Ebola or even SARS. SARS was very quickly fatal, or bubonic plague or something like that. But the consequences and the long-term medical consequences of this are literally unlike anything I've ever seen before. So I spent 36 years in the pharmaceutical industry doing a lot of clinical work, a lot of work with boards of health like FDA, but also early on in my career did a lot of work with different viruses, rhinoviruses that cause common cold, and then something that became HIV, but back then was known as HTLV3. That shows you how old I am. The problem with this virus isn't the fatality rate. The problem with this virus is the conditions that it causes. This virus goes literally into every organ system in the body. That's not usual for a virus. It obviously goes into the central nervous system because one of the cardinal symptoms is loss of taste, loss of smell. And they've actually now found virus particles in that part of the brain that regulates taste and smell. So for every 1 fatality, there are about 19 hospitalizations. With these mutations of the virus, that will start to go up. We will actually start to see more hospitalizations as that mutation becomes prevalent. For every 1 fatality, there are 18 permanent or long-term cardiac issues, including cardiac arrest. Not only does the virus get into the cardiac muscle, but it gets into the microvasculature. It gets into the small blood vessels and can cause not only clots, but it can cause inflammation. A lot of times with a virus, that hyperimmune response actually turns the body against itself and can cause some of these issues. For every 1 fatality, there are 10 permanent scarring of the lungs. I have seen CAT scans and MRIs of young female cross-country runners, probably some of the healthiest lungs you'll ever see, and there's permanent scarring at the base. They will never have the lung capacity and volume that they had before they got COVID. For every 1 fatality, there are 3 permanent kidney problems. For every 1 fatality, there are 2 strokes because of those clots that the virus causes when it gets into the cell walls of the microvascular. For every 1 fatality, there are 2 permanent cognitive dysfunctions. One study said that you lose about 10 years of cognitive ability if you have that as a side effect. You actually lose 9 to 10 IQ points in a very short period of time. And this happens in young people too. This is not just the elderly. For every 1 fatality, there are 2 significant neurological problems, and that can range from loss of taste and smell to loss of ability to walk to psychoses. And so all of those have been documented. So this is not a virus you want to mess with, even if you don't have any underlying medical conditions. We've seen strokes in 24-year-olds. It is really not discriminatory. If you have underlying medical conditions that make you more susceptible to it, all the more reasons to be careful. It gets into the thyroid, which means that it affects your metabolism. It gets into the pancreas, which means it can cause diabetes. It is really an amazing virus. I've never seen one like this. Right now, there are about 85 million confirmed cases of COVID around the world. There are about almost 2 million reported deaths at this point. In the US, we have more than 20 million cases with about 350,000 reported deaths. In December, it was reported that 1 out of every 22 people in the US probably had COVID, whether they were showing symptoms or not. And the way that the spikes occurred after Thanksgiving and the way we're now seeing a third wave of spikes, CDC has estimated that if those spikes continue, this could go as high as 1 in 3, which means look left, look right, one of you is going to come down with COVID if these spikes continue. In Los Angeles County, it's already at 1 in 5. So this is highly infectious. Like I said, not highly fatal, but highly infectious. And it is not under control. Right now, the mutations that we're seeing are actually, besides the ones in Europe, the 2 most concerning are in South Africa and Brazil, which are in their summer season. So again, confirming this is not like a flu. This is not a seasonal virus. And in fact, the World Health Organization now has said this virus is endemic. This virus will be with us forever. We don't see this going away. And the mutations are going to continue. That's what viruses do. There are not a lot of treatments still. Convalescent plasma that has antibodies in it from someone who's gone through an infection but recovered, has shown to have some effect, but not as strong as you might imagine. Most of the antivirals that have been tested against this, especially the ones that are used for the common flu, do not work against COVID. Remdesivir was approved, but it actually only works in certain very early hospitalization cases. Steroids later in the infection do help with that hyperimmune response. It sort of keeps it tamped down a little bit, but again, it will save you maybe 1 or 2 days of convalescence. Some of the most effective treatments are actually physical, moving a patient from lying on their back, which is standard in a hospital setting, to lying them on their stomach because it relieves pressure on the lungs. And so it's easier to clear the lungs out. The native immunity that your body produces to this virus is not very strong, and it's very short-lived. Most people who have had COVID only show antibodies 4 months later. It's about 12%. So most people have cleared their antibodies 3 to 12 weeks after they get COVID. There are 2 types of immune responses in the body. There's the antibody production. There's also a cellular response. It's called the T cell system. And that actually has proven to be a little bit more long lasting and a little stronger. So native immunity might be stronger than the antibodies show. However, testing for T cell immunity is very expensive and very difficult. And so the only measure that we're able to do on a quick basis is really antibody production. I did see a question in the chat, and I'm happy to answer questions as we go. The vaccine, no, the vaccine will not have the same side effects, and I can go into that later. Everything I've seen from the side effects on vaccinations means you'll get a mild flu-like reaction for a day or 2. A lot of people get a slight headache, they get a couple of chills, they get a little tired, and in 2 days it's gone. There are some serious side effects that have emerged, but they're very, very rare. Those people who have had severe allergic reactions to certain things, and it's not completely understood yet, can have a severe allergic reaction, almost an anaphylactic reaction to the vaccine. So if you have a history of severe allergic reactions, you should definitely get vaccinated in a hospital or a doctor's setting. So it happens pretty quickly. But for the most part, the vaccines are very safe, very benign. And they do, at least the 2 that are approved for emergency use now in the US, both of those are mRNA verse types of viruses, or vaccines rather. So they actually take snippets of the genetic material from the virus. They manufacture it in a way that the vaccine will then create a snippet of that protein spike. And so once that's injected, the body begins to recognize that protein spike. And if the virus comes in, once you're immune, then you will mount a response against it. So the vaccine is actually very, very well crafted at this point. I do want to talk about the vaccines a little bit. Get them. Do not hesitate, get the vaccines. Right now, there are 2 approved in the US. Both of those are based on that mRNA platform, the messenger RNA platform. It's Pfizer and Moderna. They are equal. There's no reason to eschew one and go get the other. They're about the same. What's critical is that, and this is somewhat controversial right now because we've not done a good job of rolling this out. Both of those vaccines require a booster dose. Pfizer is, I think, 3 weeks after. Moderna's is 4 weeks after. There have been a lot of people playing around saying, hey, let's vaccinate more people and delay that second dose. That's a really bad idea. Nobody's ever tested that. The first dose has been shown to produce about 50% immunity. That means it produces a low level of immunity in about 50% of the population. It's that second dose that takes it up to 90-95%. And when you're talking about the immunity that a vaccine produces, you're talking about it on an epidemiological basis. You're not talking about it giving you 50% immunity. You get full immunity if you get that immunity, but it means 5 to 10% of the population will not actually develop immunity from the vaccine. It just won't work in them. The other thing that we're finding is it takes probably 2-ish weeks for your body to actually create that immune response after you've gotten the vaccine. So you are not immune as soon as you get the shot. That means that you can still catch COVID in that meantime until the immune response actually kicks in. And we've now gotten some evidence that that's happened, where people feel like they've got Superman's cape on all of a sudden, and they get the shot and they go out without their mask and they go into a crowd, and lo and behold, they get COVID. They'll probably get fewer symptoms because the immune system will kick in eventually, but they still get COVID. So, the admonition to keep wearing your mask, keep socially distancing, we're going to be doing that into next fall. That's not going to go away anytime soon, nor should it. I mean, that does tend to flatten the curve, especially as we get into some of these mutations that are more infectious, all the more reason to be careful. What else? There are a number of other vaccines coming. AstraZeneca has a different type of vaccine that's actually predicated on what they call an attenuated virus. So they take a different kind of virus that is not, doesn't cause any disease. They put a piece of the protein on it and they inject that gets into your system. And then that primes your system to recognize the COVID vaccine. So it's just a different way of creating a vaccine. Those tend to be not as rigorous in the requirements for shipment and for transport. The mRNA vaccines require storage at a very, very low temperature, -70 degrees Fahrenheit. That transport and that storage is very difficult to do. That means that those are very difficult to send, for example, to Africa or South America. The rest of the vaccines that are coming, some of them are mRNA based. Most of the rest of them are on this adenovirus vector. And so one of those is now approved in the United Kingdom. It has not yet finished clinical trials in the United States, but it's expected that probably in March, they will also petition FDA for an emergency use authorization. So there will be a different kind of vaccine out there. Lots and lots yet to study and understand about how these vaccines work, where they work best, and what is the right kind of administration. But there are more vaccines coming. There are, I think, 6 others that are in phase 3 trials right now. The big 30,000, 40,000 person trials. Most of those trials, as a matter of fact, every one that I've seen has done a very good job of looking at an age range, at least 16, 18 on up to 85. So that covers a very big swath of the people. There are additional adolescent and children trials in the studies right now. They've also done a very good job of making these populations that they're testing diverse. So each one of these trials has about a 40% non-white component to it, so that they're really looking across racial demographics as well. So the trials have been really, really well done. What else? What are your questions? I really went through that fast, but that's sort of the biggest update. Get your flu shots if you haven't gotten your flu shot too.
My question about the vaccine had to do with, you were talking about how the virus itself gets into every kind of cell. So the gallbladder and the whatever and the whatever and the whatever. So my question was, with the vaccine, will the vaccine prevent the virus from getting into those cells?
So the vaccine will prevent the virus from creating disease is at its best. So the virus won't be replicated in the body. So the virus is inhaled, right? It's an aerosolized virus. And as soon as it gets into your nasal passages, then that virus goes everywhere and replicates. If you've got immunity to it, the virus won't get past that barrier. So it won't go anywhere. It won't replicate in the body. Okay. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it just won't go into any of those cells that you,
right.
That was so, I mean, I'd never heard that before. That's really fascinating.
Thank you. The vaccine, you can think of the vaccine as a primer. The vaccine doesn't have any viral capability to it at all. All it does is it primes your own immune response to recognize when the virus does come in and prevents it from replicating in your body. It's that replication in your body that causes the disease. So that never happens if you're immune. There's another question on chat. Let's see what it says. Specific recommendations for air exchange rates. Yeah, that's a good one, especially as we're all in winter. And it's really hard to keep the doors and the windows open, right? And I know I've been challenged on this, and I've actually even talked to the Industry Association for Air Conditioning and Heating, who obviously disagree with me, but their own studies work against them. My point of view is anything you do that circulates air in an enclosed space, remember what I said at the very beginning. If 40% of the people on average have the virus and they're shedding it, they're infectious, but you don't know it, and the other 60% who might be infectious and might develop symptoms could still be asymptomatic at that time. If you're blowing that air around a population, you're infecting those people. And so both in the summer season as well as in the winter season, my advice has been, if you're in the sanctuary and you're masked and you're socially distant and you're not singing, and there's a reason for that one, heat or air condition that sanctuary before the people walk in, and then turn off anything that blows air so that you're not circulating air around. I have one church here. I only have, of the 67 churches I've got here, I've only got 5 that are open, and 2 of them are about to close because the pastors just got infected. So we closed one before Christmas Eve. I closed another one today. I've got one very, very big sanctuary. It's my big downtown church, and they keep 2 doors open. And people keep their coats on. I mean, because at least that's got fresh air blowing in the back and it's pulling air one way instead of circulating it around. It's not ideal, but fresh ventilation is better than just recircled air. The reason not to sing, and that's a tough one. I'm glad we're past Christmas because there's so much emotion involved in that one. The reason not to sing is singing is like a sustained 4-minute cough. And a cough travels at 50 miles an hour. So 6 feet is not sufficient. And I've got videos that I can actually send to Jennifer if you're interested, that show a singer who takes in a lot of air, even a regular person off the street, not a trained operatic soprano. You take in more air in your lungs and you expel it when you sing, it goes 24 feet. And so if you're infected and you're not masked and you're singing, you're really spreading that baby. So we have been telling people here, find other ways to get music into your services if you're in your sanctuary. I've seen people do it, and it's actually quite beautiful. A pianist will play the hymn, and if they've got a screen, they'll actually put the words of the hymn up, and people run it through their minds. And it's just a beautiful meditative moment. I've seen people hum. When we had outside worship, and we had a lot of our churches do outside worship over the summer, people would sit distanced within their family groups. And when they sang, they would turn outside of a circle. So they would actually be singing away from the circle, which I said, what a beautiful way to witness to your neighbors. What a great thing to do. So there's lots of ways to do it. Some churches are singing maybe 1 or 2 verses instead of all 1,800. So they keep it a little bit less singing. But that is something to be aware of, that anything you do that expels air like that can be a bigger problem than just speaking.
What kind of advice do you have for congregations whom we all know, the session bears the responsibility to make the decision about worship? Best practices people choose to return to worship in person?
Yeah, it is a tough
calculated
one.
Risk.
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing that needs to be said is there's no way to ever make this risk-free. It's a matter of how much you can mitigate the risk. And I think that's the burden of the decision for session. So what I have been telling presbyteries and sessions here as well, and believe me, my sessions are, they're struggling with it just as much. It is the session's responsibility to determine building utilization. You can't put that on the pastor, first and foremost. Because that's session's responsibility, if they decide to open, it is also their responsibility not only to make that decision, but also to decide on what conditions need to be true and need to be in place to allow people into the sanctuary. That can be everything from pre-registration before you allow someone in for a Sunday service, so you know how many bodies are going to be there depending on the size of your sanctuary. It could be requiring masks or not. Some churches, I've got one church that requires masks when you're walking in, but if you're sitting only with your family unit, you can take the mask off. And they're big enough that they can socially distance to do that. And I've told them that's great as long as you're not singing. As soon as you start to sing, that mask better go back on. Things like how you do communion. So, I know the wafer and the cup together, that tastes horrible, but it's the cleanest way you can do communion. And because you can, instead of passing it around, you want to limit the number of things that get touched multiple times and get passed around the whole congregation. So all of the churches here have been doing some form of pre-made communion, and they leave it on a plate in the back, and the individual picks it up as they go into the sanctuary, so that only one person has touched it instead of multiples. And then you're not walking around carrying plates and breathing on everybody. Same thing with collections. The collection plate goes in the back. It doesn't get passed around. And people have learned to put their tithe and their offering in that collection plate as they walk in. Bulletins, if sanctuary doesn't have a screen that they're projecting it, the bulletins are printed and put on a table in the back, so they're not handed out. The greeters that we normally have obviously don't shake hands, but they also are not handing out the bulletins. People pick that up as they come in. So that's a primary one. It's just limit the number of times people are walking around and passing things around. The virus, like I said, is pretty wimpy. It doesn't last very long on permanent surfaces. On an impermeable surface, like a back of a pew or a collection plate, it'll last about 3 to 4 days if it's not cleaned. On a permeable surface, like a piece of paper, it lasts about 1 to 2 days. But it's a little bit like, don't even take the chance. It's just not worth it, particularly for things that we're used to passing around. Ventilation, if you can open the windows and create a stream of fresh air, that's better than the circulating air. Obviously, keep circulating air as low as possible. A lot of our older churches have radiant heat, so it's not on a fan per se, and that actually works pretty well. What else? Social distance. If you can do 12 feet instead of 6 feet, if your sanctuary is big enough, do that. If the pastor is used to, and I do have some, used to walking around the sanctuary when they preach, I would recommend against that. I would recommend that you stay back. If you're not, you don't have to be on a dais or behind a pulpit, but at least stay back, because you're doing 10 to 15 minutes of sustained talking. And so not only do you not want to be close to your congregants, you don't want them to be close to you. We are all Presbyterians. Nobody sits in the front row, so you can probably stay back a little bit. People have asked me, do the face masks work, the plexiglass face masks, particularly for older congregations that do a little bit of lip reading if it's hard for them to hear? That's a great thing for the pastor to wear during the preaching, but it does not take the place of a mask, because you can still get air underneath it. So you're still breathing in that air. If you look at a medical staff, medical personnel, they'll wear both. The plexiglass will protect you from droplets, which actually isn't as much of a problem in the winter because the air is drier. So the droplets don't get as big. But you should always wear a mask as much as you possibly can. Preaching with a mask can be done. I have some who do it or have done it. But if you've got people who really like to see you speak, then there are other ways to mitigate that. I also have had some of my churches put up plexiglass around the pulpit. so that at least for that announcements and anything that's done from the pulpit, there's a little bit of protection there. Again, it doesn't take the place of a mask, but it's just a little bit of protection. What else? If you've got groups that are meeting in your building, Alcoholics Anonymous, Boy Scouts, anything like that, that also is the purview of session. And the one thing I forgot to say was, because it's session's decision as to what needs to be true and whether or not the building is open, it is also up to session to police that on a Sunday morning. Again, you can't make the pastor do that. So if you're requiring masks and somebody walks in without a mask, your session has to understand they either have to hand them a mask and say this is required, or they have to turn them away. That's really hard to do. It is really hard to do. But that is part of the responsibility of session in this season. In the same way you wouldn't, let a clearly psychotic person off the street in the sanctuary for the protection of your congregation. This is a little bit the same thing. That's a session responsibility. So if you've got groups meeting in your church, the recommendations we've been giving is try to limit them to a single room and then have someone clean in between. So one group on a Tuesday night, the next group on a Wednesday night, but in the same room. So you're limiting the number of places people can go in the building. The biggest one, of course, is restrooms. And I've actually had churches mark off on a hallway with X's every 6 feet, just like they do at a supermarket, and one person in at a time. They've got alcohol wipes in there. And so the person who's in there wipes down anything they've touched. And when they leave, then the next person can go in. Better yet, to keep them closed if you can. Just one less thing to clean, that kind of thing. I think most of the churches have been pretty successful in limiting all of that. Churches that had been open, that had groups meeting, were very, very rigorous about what was required. So the same requirements that were put in place by session for in-person meeting were also put in place for those groups. If masks were required at Sunday, masks are required for everything. And that's the kind of thing that has to happen. There are a number of websites out there that give a lot of different data. CDC has a website that you can go to that will give you county by county current data. COVID Act Now is another very good website that can give you county by county data. Our governor here in Ohio gave us a gift because he gave us an Ohio dashboard, and that Ohio dashboard is on 7 different parameters that are objective, scientific, and medical, and we don't have to mix up emotion. And we're color-coded here in Ohio. COVID Act Now does the same thing. What we've told people is pick one website and stick to it. And don't use Facebook. That's not a credible place for information. So CDC is a good one. COVID Act Now is a good one. I've looked up your area. You've actually gotten a little bit better than you were the last time we talked, Jennifer. So you're not quite as bad. The thing to keep in mind, though, is with those websites, the infectivity rate, the positivity rate, that's one facet of this infection. The other thing, though, that drives the determination as to what color your county is how many hospital beds are available. And so if you're in an urban city like Cincinnati, we've got a ton of hospital beds here. It's actually going to get really hard for us to get to the highest level, despite how big our positivity rate is, because we've got so many beds. If you're in a rural area and you've only got 2 ICU beds, you're going to get to that top level really fast. And so you really have to look at what's behind the numbers. But pick one of those websites and use only that one, because they report different things at different times and you're never going to get them to line up. COVID Act Now is actually one of my favorites to go to. It's very, very easy. And you can go from county to county. And so what our churches here have done have been created a decision tree on the basis of the colors that are relevant for their state, because I actually cover 3 states. They will say, if we're green and yellow, we're open with these precautions. If we're orange, we're open at a much lower level with these precautions. And if we're red, we're closed. And I can send some examples of things like that you guys can adapt as well, because it takes into account all of those other things that we talked about. Who has access to the building, where they can go, Are you open? Are you open for virtual? Are you open for in-person? All of that. So there are some examples that I can send as well. Those have made the decision, back to your question, Jennifer, much, much easier for sessions to deal with because they're objective, they're laid out, the congregation can see it, and it sort of eliminates or reduces anyway the pushback. But the church across the street is open. Yeah, it is, but this is what our session decided. And a lot of the times what we've gotten is, well, that church over there is open. Yeah, well, that church has this context, this size sanctuary, and this size congregation, and you've got this size sanctuary and this size congregation. It's a really different, it's got to be church by church. So you can't compare. It can be done. I think, again, depending on your context, depending on the size of your congregation, the size of your sanctuary, it can be done. But as my congregations that have been open, and like I said, I think I've only had, since October, there's really only been 7 or so of the 67. Everybody else is closed, and most of them are virtual, not all of them. But we just closed 2 because of COVID. And so even when you think you've got it right, and even when you think you're doing everything you can, none of us are in a full bubble. And I think one of the neatest, and Jennifer, I'll send this one to you as well. There was a cartoon that came out that says, here's the bubble you think you're in, and here's the bubble that you're really in. And that actually came alive in one of those CDC calls when one of the doctors said, if Lisa's been exposed to 10 people today, and everybody on this call's been exposed to 10 people, and there are 13 of us, 14 of us, that means each one of us has been exposed to 140 people. That's a much big bubble than we think we have. And that's really something to put in context for your congregation as well. I had one back early, April of last year. I have one little tiny congregation out in Indiana. And they're mostly older people, and they are literally in the middle of a cornfield and with nothing around them. So their point of view is, first of all, we're a family. We miss each other. We're isolated. I'm like, do you go get gas in the course of a week? Well, yes. Well, then you're not isolated. Do you go to the supermarket? Yes. Then you're not isolated. It's not just you in the cornfield. It's everybody you touch before you get to the cornfield. So they ended up having outside worship for a while, and then they closed down. And I think that's one of the hardest things for people. I've seen sessions struggle with it, and behaviors come out that probably were there before because they're feeling so out of control and so distant from what they knew and cherished, to the point now where I've done a couple of sermons over the last couple of months that all say, we don't want to go back to normal. I mean, normal, the way you're thinking about it, is nostalgia. And normal wasn't working for us, frankly. Normal wasn't working for us when we were normal. It was closing our churches. It was closing our minds. It was stunting our witness. What are we going to be next? What have we learned from this? And what is God dreaming for us from this point forward? And so don't try to go back to normal. Try to figure out what's core that you take with you into this next new journey. And some have wrapped their minds around that, and some have not gotten there yet.
Always reforming.
Yes, exactly right.
A comment in the chat: what do you anticipate if, say, 50% say 50% of people have COVID or the vaccine? Yeah,
so it's a really good question, because those that have COVID, like I said, probably will not have long-lasting immunity. And so we're not going to get back to anything that looks more open until at least 70% of the population has been vaccinated. So just having a vaccine does us no good. It's the vaccination that will bring us back. That gets us to the term that you've heard, herd immunity. If the mRNA vaccines keep at a 90 to 95% effective rate, and 70% of the population gets vaccinated, that means at least about 65% of the population will be immune. That's a good thing. Of course, we have to have the whole globe immune before we can start international travel again. But, so if only 50% of the population is vaccinated and we're at 90%, that means we're about 45% immune, and that's not enough, frankly. So Andrew, you had another question.
Yeah, I just kind of a follow-up. The issue is, as we have people in the congregation who have COVID, and maybe it was mild, maybe, you know, they were down for a week or whatever. Now they've come back, they've had it. And so why don't we get back for those who have graduated, so to speak, back to normal?
Graduated because they are no longer immune. So that's the first answer. And there are documented cases of reinfection because that native immune response is so weak and so short-lived. And because we now have mutations in the virus, you can get this a second time. And that means that you still don't know if you're infectious at any given time. So until you get a vaccine where you can actually on a population basis, and this is where the vaccination part of it gets a little wonky. It's an epidemiologic, it's a population measure that you're looking at. When you've got the majority of the people around you who have some form of longer lasting immunity because of the vaccine, and the vaccine has been shown to have longer lasting immunity than the native response. The other piece to remember, and remember I said the World Health Organization has now declared this to be an endemic virus. It's not going away. That means this is likely to be an annual shot, just like the flu. And it's likely to be an annual shot that requires a booster. Most of the vaccines that we've all received as children, mumps, measles, rubella, diphtheria, all of that, that's a one and done. This is not. This is not going to be that. The flu vaccine we get every year because the variant on the flu migrates. But, and this one may as well. But my guess is the immune response itself will dictate this becomes an annual vaccine. Does that answer your question, Andrew?
It does. And I'm thinking there's an education component here, because I think a lot of people assume that if they have recovered, then that they have immunity. But what I'm hearing is if 2/3 of your population has it and recovers, if none of them have had vaccine, you're right back where you started.
That's exactly right. It is exactly right. Ken, you had a question.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. I understand about, if you've had it, then your immune response it's less than if you're vaccinated. Are you more susceptible to getting it again than somebody who has not had it, period?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the answer is no. I think the answer, remember I said there are two types of immune response. There's the antibody response itself, which is mostly what people have been able to measure. But then there's that innate cellular response. My guess is the fact we have seen cases of re-getting it. I just lost the word. Reinfection, thank you. But it's actually fairly low. I mean, it does happen, it can happen, but it's fairly low. What that tells me as an immunologist is that the T cell immunity that's produced the first time you get it is probably stronger than we think. But like I said, that's really expensive and very difficult to measure. And so you're not going to see a lot of data on that. That actually goes against my answer to Andrew. It could be that we have more protection than we know, but right now we don't know it. And so to keep people safe, you're better off pretending that you're not immune anymore once you've had it. There's never, I don't think there's ever going to be a cape of protection against coronavirus, against this version of coronavirus, the way there is against some of the other things that we had vaccines for. I think that's it.
I think that's it. This is a lot of information, and some of it's new or newly presented, and I'm grateful for that. It seems that coming on the heels of yesterday, that has left a lot of us emotionally depleted. It doesn't surprise me that we're not bubbling over with questions and comments and responses and what ifs. But we're very grateful, Lisa, to have had you with us. My hunch is that, as with all things, you'll have questions that arise, and hope is that you will feel free to either contact me and I'll get you in touch with Lisa, or she'll send some information and you can run to the website and see if that is helpful, because I believe that one of our strengths in this season and this time in the life of the church is that we truly are a connectional church, and we don't all have to be epidemiologists, but we know one. and we have opportunities together to face this and to address it and to move through it in ways make us stronger.
I'm happy to answer questions on an ongoing basis. Email or calls are fine. If there's anything that you think you need to make a case with your session or your presbytery, let me know. And if I don't have it, I can probably figure out how to dig it up. So more than happy to help. Thank you for having me, Ken. It's great to see you again.
In the meantime, God bless you and keep you and make God's face shine upon you and give you peace.
Blessings to all of you. Thank you. And stay well.
You too. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Join us for worship, Sundays at 10 a.m. Learn more at our website, presby.net.